Welcome to the inaugural Arsenal Vision podcast. My name is Elliot Smith. You may know me on Twitter as Yankee Gunner, and I am not thrilled or delighted to be here, unfortunately, because we are coming to you fresh off the loss to Manchester United at the Emirates, a game that ultimately ended 2-1, and I think everybody would agree was a huge disappointment. We've got some great guests to talk to today. We'll start with James from Gooner Fanatic 49. James, thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
And Paul from Poznan in My Pants. Paul, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Elliot, I think.
Yeah, well, it's not the occasion we would have hoped, but on the bright side, at least we can all sit here and pick the bones out of the loss. So that'll be a lot of fun. There's a lot to get to, and obviously it was a hugely disappointing result, if not a hugely disappointing performance. But maybe the best place to start is to just talk about before the match. I think the first question everybody had was who the manager would pick. So, James, when you saw the lineups, what was your initial thought of the team he chose and what our prospects would be with that 11?
I think, quite frankly, I was fairly content with the lineup. I wasn't particularly surprised to see both Ramsey and Wilshere placed in the midfield, sort of in front of Mikel Arteta, with seemingly Alexis pushed out to the left. From a defensive point of view, there's been a slight sort of call for Bellerin to perhaps be moved outright with Chambers back into the centre instead of Nacho. But Wenger clearly was sort of, he's been trying to, given the sort of defensive issues, look towards slightly more an experienced and comfortable lineup at the back. And in all honesty with you, I think especially given the sort of recent performances from Santi, I'm not sure if sort of the lineup itself was the issue going into the game. I thought Jack actually played quite well in that midfield alongside Aaron, and I thought he was sort of one of our more dangerous players before the injury took place. I think we created. I know you said earlier on that both the result and the performance were a disappointment, but from a performance point of view, I thought, especially up until we conceded that goal, I thought we looked definitely the stronger side. We certainly had a significant number of chances to take the lead and really sort of take the game to United. But as has been the issue for much of the season thus far, especially you can look towards the City game where we've had periods of at least slight domination in the earlier part of the game, and we really just haven't we haven't sort of taken advantage of that situation, and that was really sort of I felt our undoing.
Paul, would you have done anything different? I've just made you manager. Would you have done anything different with the starting 11, or for the most part, do you think it sort of picked itself?
I think it largely picked itself. I think my big reactions when I saw the lineup was tempered delight that Arteta was in the lineup.
Absolutely.
To give us structure. Of course, a little unsure as to how fit he was. It turns out, well, I'm sure we'll get into that, but he certainly didn't let us down. And I think my other reaction was it looked like Sanchez would line up on the left, which caused some anxiety for me because he's been so strong through the middle, so deadly. And I guess my third thought that went along with that was picking Jack and Ramsey in the midfield. Kind of the negative voice in my head, which I try to ignore as much as possible, was did the manager wimp out a little bit of not picking one of the two of them? Because obviously that set us up as a 4-3-3, Sanchez over to the left. I guess the defending point might have been that Sanchez was very likely to run out of gas at some stage, given his 290 minutes for Chile and arriving back on the Friday after a 463-hour flight back. So there was, maybe he didn't want to build the team with Sanchez at the number 10 spot, or it being an Arsenal United badly wanted as much work rate in the middle between Ramsey and Jack. And I guess the final reaction, obviously, we now expect Chamberlain to play on the right. So there was some delight there because it was a pretty safe bet, but he's been in such really good form. But of course, that meant that Cazorla, who's been out of form, was on the bench, though I tend to find that I'm more critical of his finishing than his overall play lately. Maybe that was a little different today. Maybe maybe he didn't quite come up to what I had expected him to do when he came on, but maybe that was a hard task at that point. Anyway, that was my reaction to the lineup.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the reality is, I think to your point, and when you look at the way Ramsey's been playing, his position in the squad might be a little bit vulnerable, but ultimately Cazorla hasn't played well enough. I think that he has to be in the starting 11. And as a result, I think it was pretty easy 11 to pick. James, you mentioned that some people would like to see Bellerin playing at right back and Chambers moved to center back, but I don't think there was ever really much of a chance to do it. And ironically, if you want to point to the things we did well today, I certainly don't think Nacho Monreal had a poor game at center back. And I thought Chambers had one of his best games in an Arsenal shirt in a lot of ways, especially going forward, and created a lot of the chances that we made in the first half. I mean, ultimately, I don't know that anybody had much of an argument with the starting 11. Probably the biggest thing for me when I looked at the team sheets was when I saw that United was playing a back three, especially with the personnel they have. I felt like there would be chances, and sure enough, there were chances. James, you talked about the performance being pretty good, and I tend to agree with you, but, here's a question I posed on Twitter. I said, at halftime, if you should be 4-0 up, but it's 0-0, was it a good half or a bad half? So the question is, do you take the positives out of that first half performance where we really battered them and they looked terrible and we probably should have put a few goals in, or do you have to be critical of the fact that once again it's players not making the big contribution in the big moment in the big game?
Well, I mean, listen, you always want to take the positives from a game, especially going into halftime.
Well, I don't. I love to take the negatives from a game.
Well,
have you met me before?
Well, apparently not. But it's funny because I walked into the stadium and I was talking with this friend of mine that I go to the games with more often than not. And he said, the most important thing is that we put in a good shift tonight. I said, well, quite frankly, I'm not particularly concerned about the performance as such. The only thing that is of any importance tonight, especially against this United side, which I think now, you correct me if I'm wrong, that we've only sort of won one out of the last 15 fixtures against, is just to get the 3 points. And I would have absolutely taken getting a full battering the entire 90 minutes and getting some last gasp sort of scrappy victory, much in the sort of the ilk of maybe sort of the Crystal Palace game, for example. But it's tough because one of the major issues that we've sort of levied against the side, whether it be against Swansea or even sort of the first 60 minutes against Burnley or Sunderland, is this is still a team that's struggling to click and sort of struggling to gel together. And maybe it's just because I have this sort of blinkered Arsenal vision on, but I came out of that first half thinking, this is, especially against like McNair and Blackett at the back, with Wilshere in the midfield looking quite sort of spriteful and all. I really thought this was a game that we could have won. Going into the back of that first half, but it was very typical and sort of classic Arsenal in all the wrong ways, unfortunately. And I think you can only but look at the negatives coming out of a result like that. In fact, I think seeing that 8 minute stoppage time at the end, I sitting in the stand thought, well, this is, there were a couple of sort of cheerful hopes from those around me, but I was thinking quite the opposite. I thought, bloody hell, I've got to endure another sort of 8 minutes of this. And
was it at halftime? I know we could talk a little bit about the atmosphere in the stand at full time, but at halftime, was it upbeat? People felt good about the performance, thought we'd still go on to win, or what? Was there a lot of sort of trepidation about the fact that we had not converted our period of dominance into a lead? Because I think, I tweeted, we're dominating, they look terrible, something to that extent, but then I tagged it by saying that's usually when it all goes wrong for us. And I think there was a sense of deja vu about that. I mean, were people at the ground pretty nervous at halftime that we hadn't converted the dominance into a lead?
There was certainly a little bit of disappointment that we hadn't scored at least a goal given the chances we created, but there was a lot of positivity coming into that halftime break. I think, you can talk about sort of the full-time whistle. There was certainly a large sort of chorus of boos that were directed towards, I imagine, both the manager and the players, and a little bit towards the officials. But I I amongst many was quite sort of heartened by the first half performance, and in particular, I thought the crowd itself. I mean, I only recently I've been sort of the North London derby and the Anderlecht game, but I thought there was a genuine buzz about the game. I mean, it obviously was sort of against United. You had that guy playing against his old club, and the sort of the Dutch skunk playing against us, so which added to the occasion. But there was. I certainly don't remember an atmosphere much like it for quite a while, at least until whatever it was, the 60th minute, when we conceded. So I think, I mean, aside from what was going on Twitter, etc., the crowd certainly seemed positive. It's just, as you would expect, there was certainly a significant amount of frustration at the same time of the chances that we let pass by, which ended up being sort of a major sort of disappointment going in, looking back at the end of the 90 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, obviously the chances were there, but I think this is the problem. I mean, when we do get ourselves goals, we tend to not be stable enough at the back, and then it feels like sometimes, when we are dominating games, we don't convert that into a lead on the score sheet. I mean, in your estimation, what was the reason we didn't get on the score sheet in the first half? Was it just lack of composure and finishing? Do you think it was that De Gea was really that good? I mean, would you say that we have only ourselves to blame in the first half, or do you think we were a little unlucky?
We only have ourselves to blame. The manager used the word efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
He used the term 80%. I was thinking 80% a lot today. And maybe for our season so far, the 80% between that's played between kind of that last ball that our defenders play, or that last touch that our attackers take. I think we've all seen some stats that say we're actually one of the best, if not the best team, kind of, if you ignore the top and the tail of our performance. Those dumb things we've done in defense, and the efficiency on the other end, Sanchez excluded. I mean, if you think of Jack's effectively one-on-one with De Gea in that first half, which we were all kicking ourselves and all wondering, is that the one that's going to come back to bite us? The answer was yes. And compare that moment to the one against Hart in the City game, and they were fairly similar. In fact, the Hart opportunity might have been a little tougher, but Jack chose to beat Hart with his right foot because he mentioned something about training with them in the English camp, and he knew Hart would expect him to go to his left foot. Well, guess what? De Gea expected him to go to his left foot, and Jack took an extra step and he blocked it. And, these matches come down to narrow margins. And, we had 2 or 3 times the number of shots on goal. But going back to the halftime discussion, I think we were all in the same boat of saying, well, that was really good. That was really exciting. That was really attacking. But we have a horrible feeling we're going to regret the chances we didn't take, and a horrible feeling that the few chances United do take, those counter-attacking opportunities, they're probably going to get sometime later in the second half. Will they be more ruthless than we were? And guess what? You've 2 players. Rooney gets 300k a week for a reason. He's maybe not world class, but he's got a world class mentality when he plays against us.
I mean, is that the problem, though?
That.
I look at it, and, we rate our players so highly. And, Paul, you and I have talked about this on another podcast before. I should say I have. We rate Oxlade-Chamberlain and Ramsey and Wilshere and Welbeck and all those guys so highly. But, I mean, does Van Gaal maybe have a point? I mean, if some of those chances fall to a Van Persie or a Falcao instead of a Welbeck, if some of those chances fall to an Aguero or Yaya Toure instead of a Jack Wilshere or an Oxlade-Chamberlain, I mean, maybe we do have a 2 or 3 goal lead. Is it just the fact that the problem for us right now is, Alexis aside, when chances do fall to us, we're seeing the difference between the really elite players in the game who take them, and our players who don't always take them, and that, that's the margin right now.
I think so. I think if you had Henri on the pitch today, he would have put one of them away, and and
or
that's
a
just talking about
Perez, instead of a Wilshere,
Yeah, and that's the opportunities that were there for them today. A Perez, a Bergkamp, and Henri would have made even more kind of somethings out of nothings, as Sanchez tends to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's that little bit extra at the top end that we're not creating, that we're not finishing, and those things all lead to belief. I mean, part of the mentality is eventually the players start thinking, this doesn't seem to be happening. When you have a player up front that you think can win you a game, like when we had Henri up front, well, United have, Rooney up front, and their team don't think, well, we don't deserve to win this. We're not the stronger team. They think if we could just get that one chance to Rooney, he'll put this away, and he does. And our team looks forward and they say, well, we're playing well, we should win, but I got this sneaking suspicion that maybe we won't. And they look up and they don't see the guy that's going to bury it for them, especially if Sanchez is out to the left.
I think it's kind of a red herring if we talk about it too long. So I just want to ask you guys both one question, one word answer, just yes or no, because then I want to move on to something else. But just yes or no, when Wilshere clashed with Luke Shaw, James, did you have that as a penalty or no?
Obviously, I saw it very quickly, but I'm inclined to say yes. You guys have seen the replay, so you're probably better judge than I. But I was certainly amongst the uproar that suggested that it should have been a penalty.
Paul?
No.
Yeah, I tend to think no. I mean, you could go with the old "I've seen them given," but you could argue that there were 3 big calls in the game that were wrong, and 2 of them went in our favor. So, Wilshere not getting sent off, and then the ridiculous offside call that stopped them from having a clear counterattack when they were a good yard and a half onside in the second half. Ultimately, I don't think that there's anyone that necessarily needs to be singled out for criticism here. I thought overall, on an individual level, I thought a lot of the players put in a pretty good performance. But there are 2 for me that stand out, and they're important, I think, to talk about because I think they're 2 players that are problematic for us right now. Jack Wilshere and Aaron Ramsey. Wilshere obviously had the crucial miss. He lost his temper. He could have been sent off. He got himself hurt. I say he got himself hurt because I think that's sort of the style of his play. And Ramsey generally was just sloppy, looking to shoot when it wasn't time. Once again, not necessarily doing the basic things. Starting with Jack and maybe then just touching on Ramsey as well a little, James. I mean, at what point does Wilshere have to stop does Wenger have to stop indulging his players? I mean, I look at Ferguson and Mourinho, and the thing they both have in common is they expect a certain type of behavior and they expect a certain type of performance, and if they don't get it, they'll either sell you or bench you, one of the two. And Wenger just seems to have certain players that he indulges, and Jack is certainly one of them. He always tries to get him in the side if he's fit. Obviously he's a prodigious talent, but his attitude, his behavior, his professionalism, and his performances to some extent don't necessarily warrant it. Did you find yourself sort of losing patience with Wilshere today? And how did you feel about, the missed chance, the loss of his composure and his day overall?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm very interested to get both of your takes on this because I know both of you are quite the aficionados of Jack.
I used to be a huge
used
fan.
To be.
I used to be, yeah.
Well, I mean, in fact, I do think he had a slightly better performance today. I guess sort of alongside the City performance where he was, one of the sort of standout performers. But it's a tough balance with Wenger, isn't it? Because a lot of players will sort of attest to the fact that one of the sort of key qualities of Wenger is the amount of faith that he tends to show in players. And I think, given the sort of comments both of yourselves have made about Jack, I don't think it's ridiculous to suggest that many fans would almost expect Jack or think of Jack as being sort of on the cusp of making it to that next level. I think, you see the qualities in Jack. He's got so many, that sort of burst of pace from deep where he can beat that player and create that space for himself, and that sort of that close sort of ball control, his ability to find players in the final third, and and that in itself is exciting, and especially as an Arsenal fan, given sort of his love for the club, you do will him on, don't you? But I think he's been one of the most frustrating players, certainly alongside Aaron this season. But unfortunately, Jack hasn't had the kind of season that Aaron had last year to defend himself with, and it's tough because I don't know the statistic offhand, but I know that I think I know for a fact that the results with Wilshere in our side this season compared to without him are certainly far worse. And you can't but look to that chance today, and you can't. Even before that, you had him sort of breaking into space on the edge of the area and him curling it right into De Gea's arms, and think that if we want him to be the player that we think he can be, those are chances he has to be taking. Those are times when he has to be putting us ahead and really sort of taking the game by the scruff of the neck. And it's a tough one for me because I have all the will in the world to sort of love Jack and wish him to become that sort of the star player that you would hope and think that he can be. But as of right now, I think he's a player that doesn't necessarily deserve to be in the first 11. And I think one of his other issues is, and I unfortunately didn't sort of get to see it particularly well from where I was sitting, but as you've suggested, he probably should have been sent off given the clash that he had with Fellaini. And that hardly comes as any surprise to any sort of Arsenal fan, I imagine, because he's someone that he's passionate, but he doesn't tend to sort of direct that passion in the right way. If you understand what I was saying,
Yeah.
He tends to be a little too enthusiastic, and especially from the sideline, you tend to think, well, as a professional, you need to rein that in slightly. You need to direct that into your play. You need to take that against your opponents, with the ball at your feet, and it's not something certainly not recently that he's tended to do. And especially given that type of attitude, that there just tends to be a significant sort of air of frustration surrounding him.
I think you also have to weigh into this. When you take a player like Mesut Ozil out of midfield, who's so precise and controlled and reliable and moves in space well and does everything in sort of a measured, calculated way, and instead replace him with a Jack Wilshere and Aaron Ramsey, who kind of are the opposite of that. They have their inspirational bursts, but they're all over the place. They're not as tactically astute. They make a lot of little errors. It's exaggerated because the drop-off from an Ozil to a Jack Wilshere, just in terms of the control of the game, the composure within the game, the precision within the game, is massive. Paul, I know that it's unfair to really pick on any one player or any two players, but I think that there's been an issue this season where Jack or Aaron have continually caused us problems. I mean, the midfield should be an area of strength for us. And due to Arteta being out injured and going with Flamini, and Ozil being out injured and Cazorla being out of form, it hasn't been. And we've been trying to shoehorn Ramsey and Wilshere into the midfield almost all season. I mean, at this point, are you ready to say the manager has to look for alternatives to those guys?
Well, what we need here is a contrarian, and so here I come.
All right.
I think if we look at today, the options weren't that great. It was Cazorla, who was a little bit out of form.
He's out of form also, yeah.
Rosicky, who maybe we're all wondering why we aren't seeing more of, but maybe today wasn't that game. I expect to see him a bit more in the Champions League so far, but we haven't. So, and if you look at what we produced in that 80% between, some clumsy defending and some wasted attacking. I mean, we had 23 attempts on goal versus 12. And that includes some of the later breakaway goals that were because we were being breakaway attacks from United. I mean, had we scored one or two of those goals earlier on and then kind of been a little bit more sane, the stats might have been a little even more favorable in our direction. with 9 on target versus 2, 11 corners versus 5, etc., etc. So if you look at what their production was supposed to be, I think maybe the manager got it right today. From Ramsey, I'll have to look at it a second time because you tend to remember the high and the low notes for both him and Jack. I mean, if Jack puts his goal away, we don't have a word to say about him today. Well, maybe we do. Maybe that's a little overstatement.
Well, and by the way, I mean, whether that's true or not, I think failing to put away a relatively rudimentary chance on your strongest foot that would have given you the lead, is cause for criticism.
It's certainly cause for criticism, and it's a goal he should have put away. But having played a little bit of football in my time, those ones you ought to put away. How many of those ought to put aways are missed by players on all sides? So
they absolutely are. You know what, Paul? I think the reason I say it that way, though, is just that it's putting those away that is the difference between, the teams that win titles and the teams that compete on the biggest stages. If that's an Iniesta, that's a goal. If that's, arguably a Fabregas, or if it's a Yaya Toure, who, I don't necessarily have at my fingertips the names of the players for all the best clubs around the world, but if it's a James Rodriguez, those are goals, and isn't that really the problem? That's where we want to be, and that's what we should be expecting.
True, but Jack doesn't carry that same attacking onus that those players you mentioned. It would be nice if he did. If we were talking about Ramsey, I think that's fair, because one of the reasons Ramsey's on the pitch is to finish those midfield attacking moves. Now, it's not that Jack doesn't have that burden or isn't required or isn't capable, but he's a little bit more coming from deep, making something happen. Now, maybe in a midfield 3, blah, 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 you can say, well, his but I think if you look at the pecking order, Arteta would be expected to be the bit more deep. Jack would be doing more of the forward and back running, and Ramsey would be expected to do a little bit more of the finishing. Now, there's no hard and fast line, so I'll back off a little bit from an Iniesta comparison with maybe Jack on finishing. And the manager has said he doesn't expect Jack to be a goal scorer, and Jack took some umbrage at it, and he has expected Ramsey to be a goal scorer, and he complied last year. But to your bigger point, I think if you look over the season in general, there's really good arguments to make about whether Jack or Ramsey should have started as many games as they did, and whether other people should have got a look in. I think Jack has shown enough form in his couple of England games and in the couple of games before that to be on that field today, and if he finish that one off, and if you look at our overall production, there's probably not too much we would have said about him. Ramsey's the other one, but given the options today and given the work rate he can put in, I'd like to go back and look at the tape, as they say, and see how the rest of his performance was. I think he's the bigger one for debate.
That's fair. For me, the problem I just have is, I get frustrated with the manager because I feel like he tolerates performances and continues to put players out on the pitch and start them week in, week out without necessarily being in any way related to how they've performed in the previous game. And I think as a player, if you feel secure in your place, regardless of performance, then there's a question of whether you ever feel the need to lift your performance or pressure to lift your performance. And you might say, well, Elliot, I'm sure Jack and Ramsey want to lift their performance. But this is how you forge clutch players. This is how you forge players with bottle and with nerve, is you take away their place and you say you have to earn it back. And then when they get a chance to earn it back, then if they come through, that forges real nerve and metal and bottle, whatever word you want to use there. And if they don't come through, then you start to develop a resume on this player that says, that says this is not a player who will perform in key situations, and then you move on from them. Because I think talent is obviously a very important metric, but I do think there's something to be said for combining talent and nerve, the ability to perform in the biggest moments. If there was a knock on Thierry Henry, and I always thought it was a little unfair, the knock on him was even that he would miss big chances in crucial moments. And I think it's been years and years and years now that this Arsenal team in general has failed to perform at the biggest moments against the biggest rivals. And that's obviously a larger talking point we could, get to over the next 3.5 months that we're recording this podcast. But moving on to the second half for a minute, and ultimately I do think the performance was pretty good, and we dominated them. I think they were really, really bad as well, which didn't hurt. They get the goal. I don't know that we need to focus too much on the goal. It was sloppy. It was poor communication. I don't fully understand what Gibbs was thinking there. Szczesny flapped a little bit. But
just to add, Elliot, I was listening to Lee Dixon. I don't know if you were too in your commentary, and his view, and obviously he's played a little bit more than I have in those positions.
Once or twice.
Was that Szczesny would have called for that, and Gibbs should have got the hell out of the way for that. So that was one perspective. I don't know. I saw a lot of the reason I bring it up is I saw a lot of comments on Twitter about Szczesny screwing up and what was Szczesny thinking, etc. That was Lee Dixon's perspective. Szczesny had the right to have his way cleared so he could come at that ball aggressively.
I tend to agree with that. I think also what happened on the actual goal itself is I think Gibbs was caught in two minds in a key moment where he didn't know whether he could let that ball go or had to make a play on it because he didn't know what was behind him. But yeah, I'm more interested in actually talking about their second goal. So in his post-match comments, the manager said, and I want to quote it, it was just after a corner and we were not cautious enough. I don't know why we had nobody at the back at all. You could see straight away that giving a 2-against-1 in your own half means you will be punished against these players. First of all, that happens to us a lot. Second of all, they had several opportunities for that to happen. We got off let off by a wrong offside flag that went up that stopped what surely would have been a second goal, and Di Maria should have had a third on the same thing. How on earth do you explain how we approach late game situations where we're a goal behind and we're chasing a goal when everybody in the stadium could see that eventually they were going to get us on the counter? And how do you explain the manager not knowing what his players are doing, not understanding what his players are doing, and not finding a way to communicate to his players on the pitch that what they're doing isn't what he wants them to do? I mean, James, I'll start with you. Everything about that last 15 or 20 minutes, to me, it shows the naivete and lack of nuance, lack of professionalism about the way we approach the finer details of a game. Surely a team should have a more refined way of chasing a 1-goal deficit at home than putting 10 men in the opposition half and waiting to get picked off on the counter, and then having your manager not be able to explain it. So what's your reaction to how we got picked off, how we approached chasing the game late, and then the manager's comments that he didn't understand why we were playing that way?
Well, to be honest with you, Elliot, I think I'm as baffled as you. I don't think I really have the answer that you're sort of searching for.
Moving on.
It did reek, slightly of desperation because, when we conceded that second goal, it wasn't as though we were sort of, in the last minute of stoppage time where you throw the goalie forward and you throw everyone in the box and you just hope, you sort of hope it pulls off. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was literally just Nacho Monreal sitting on the halfway line with literally everyone else packed into the box. And I at a live game, so I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it with players like Di Maria and Rooney just both charging at Nacho, and he's there sort of on his left, on his right, sort of caught in two minds. And it's one of the simpler goals you've seen conceded in certainly in many of the games that I've seen. And I'm not really sure that there is any excuse for it, quite frankly. I mean, even when you're chasing a game like that, I mean, at home we're in the grand scheme of things, we're still but a goal down. It's not a time of complete desperation where you throw your entire kitchen sink at the problem. And I think it's as Gary Neville would often attest, it's a slight sort of lack of patience and almost a slight lack of confidence in the team's ability, because if with 10 minutes left in a game and you're 1-0 down at home, you've still got to believe in yourself and you've still got to have the faith that you can get that goal back without having to just sort of, it wasn't a Sonogo that was thrown on today, but so it might as well have been, quite frankly. And I've got to apologise, but I'm I'm slightly stunned by that goal. As the goal was happening, when I think it was Di Maria that picked it up on the halfway line, I looked at my friend and I said, am I watching the same game that you're watching?" As Nacho was sort of just left in the quicksand, and it's certainly been one of the more frustrating components of watching this Arsenal team this season. This sort of idea of game management and the decisions that I think, more importantly, it's easy to sort of levy criticism towards the manager, and I think he's obviously certainly not blameless, but. We're talking about a team that's full of internationals at the moment, the likes of Pear, etc., that we've talked about having, being a World Cup winner, etc. And I'm just not, I'm not sure what's going through their mind at this time, because we seem to be making fairly repetitive mistakes in the grand scheme of things over and over again. And I'm not, certainly.
But James, I mean, not to cut you off here, but I mean, this is what drives me nuts. Okay, Wenger gets beaten with the tactics stick a lot, and some of it may not be fair. But here, I think it is a very, very fair question, because this is the second time in 2 weeks he's talked about the players sort of having the freedom to decide things on the pitch, and here talking about not being sure why players are doing something. You read about managers like Pep Guardiola who draw squares, on the training pitch. And if a player isn't inside the square he's supposed to be in, they get yelled at and told to get back in their square, or whatever the case may be. That is poorly paraphrasing an article I read about Pep that is probably not remotely the exact explanation, but you get the idea. These managers who are maniacal about the details. And here we are talking about Arsene Wenger, conceding the most rudimentary of goals, to a counterattack, down only one goal at home. And not only that, not understanding why his players are playing that way. And I just feel like in an era where you have managers like Mourinho and Guardiola who are so maniacal in their control of every detail about how their team plays, it would seem fairly rudimentary to just have a strategy for how you're going to play if you fall behind in a game. And it doesn't even appear we had that. I mean, Paul, surely there has to be a way to chase a game without everybody in the stadium and everybody watching at home knowing you're about to concede another.
It is. I mean, I'm going to join the baffling group here. It is baffling. I mean, did we all have the same reaction when we saw Per playing it out of defense into midfield and then continuing up the wing without the ball? It's like, oh Jesus, it's going to be this sort of ending.
Yeah. But I mean, what's the strategy? Do you believe, Arsene, that his players are just freestyling and doing whatever they want and he has no ability to control that? Or do you think this is sort of the instruction he gave when he sent players on? I mean, why is it happening? And if it's not his direction, then why isn't he doing something about it?
It seems to me there seems to be a bit of separation, a bit of mismatch between Arsene and his team that I haven't seen maybe in previous seasons where things were going poorly. He seems to be expressing more frustration. This naivety comment is kind of, it's a couple of matches now where he's kind of almost throwing up his hand saying, yeah, beats me. I don't know why we were doing what we were doing. The implication being, and I think against Anderlecht, I was asking, well, I think I said, I can't see what Wenger was doing on the sidelines, but surely he was shouting at his players to get back. And apparently from one or two people who were at the match and from a journalist, Wenger had been kind of doing his nut at what his players were doing and where they were going and why we were chasing a game we were actually winning. So to the bigger question, I think the interesting discussion will be, has the game moved on from a point where the detail sweating kinds of managers, the ones who look at all the data and the stats and decide where is the most optimum place to put your players on a pitch, and basically forcing teams into a very rigid structure and approach, the Simeones, I guess you could say the Klopps, the high pressure pressing teams, or Mourinho, who maybe builds it a little bit more from the back. These guys who have a very, you could say, rigid scientific approach, whether Wenger's more creative, inspiring, free-flowing, trust the players, but and I don't think he doesn't give them a plan and that they don't have a structure and they don't plan things. But it's a question of degree, and he's way down the other end of the spectrum in terms of how rigid he sends his teams out. And I just wonder, is that what we're going to see here? Can Arsenal adapt? Is this just kind of a funk we're in, or has the game moved to a point where, and to be honest, that's not really what we saw today, because United were it was a very open game, pretty free flowing. If we'd just been more clinical, we would have won it, kind of thing. So today isn't necessarily the best measure of it, but in the broader scheme, the Southamptons, the Swanseas, Liverpool, depending on what tactics they take on, have been, the Pochettinos with the much more scientific optimized positioning, tactics, pressing, etc., versus Wenger's more creative, more fluid, more trusting his players. I do sense a lot of frustration between Arsene and what's going on the pitch that I haven't seen at other times.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I think it's difficult sometimes because we do build a narrative for a season, and then we try to fit things into that narrative. And the narrative this season has very much been, he didn't buy a center back, he didn't buy a defensive midfielder, and that derailed our season. Neither of those things influenced what happened today. We didn't lose today because Nacho Monreal was playing center back, and we didn't lose today because Mikel Arteta was at defensive midfielder. In fact, I thought Mikel Arteta had an excellent game. And I don't think Nacho Monreal did much wrong either. We lost today because we weren't clinical. We didn't take advantage of our period of dominance, but I think we also lost today because of the way we played the last 20 minutes of the game. And either the manager instructed his team to play that way, which is insanity, or the team played that way in defiance of the manager's instructions, which is a problem. And so I think that last 20 minutes is very troubling because there was no nuance to the way we went about attacking them. We just threw every single person into their half and, tried basically pushing through them like a battering ram. And we left ourselves completely exposed to counterattack after counterattack.
And can I add something there, Elliot?
Yeah, please.
One of the commentators made a really good point, which was the way we attacked in that period by doing so much through the middle was almost guaranteeing counter-attacking opportunities for them, because that's where they were tightly packed, dense. That's where we were attacking them from. Had we used more width and attacked them on both wings and come at them from the sides, we wouldn't have been as vulnerable on turnovers. So in the end, we played right into their hands in the last 20 minutes by going up through the middle. I mean, it wasn't entirely through the middle, but that was pretty dominant in our play. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also, I thought in general, not to pick on him, I'm not sure Kieran Gibbs had the best day either, because when he did overlap or did get into position, he was poor. I mean, I felt bad too. Unfortunately, once again, Cazorla came on and really didn't do very well. I thought his volleyed chance could have been taken better, but at one point, he had the easiest overlap pass to play to Gibbs, and he basically hit it too heavy, and Gibbs had to slide at the end line just to get a foot on it. And I think that's sort of endemic of what's going on with us right now too, is just that we're not minding the details. The overlap passes are being hit just a little too hard. The shots are right at the keeper. We're wasting free kicks and corners, which is nothing new, but just the little details. And I think this is where, unfortunately it comes back to the manager and to the point you made about detail-oriented management. I just think you have managers today who micromanage more, who are in control of more of the details, who are more rigid in their demand for specific attention to specific detail. And I think Arsenal is a team that looks like a team that just does not pay attention to the finer points, to the finer details, and does not necessarily have a plan. United should have been demoralized and beaten before halftime. But I think teams know if they can stay in a game with Arsenal, they have a chance to get something from a game. You look at Anderlecht in the Champions League, and that's the case. I think we've talked the game to death. There's obviously, we could pick more bones out of it. I don't even think it merits really discussing Giroud's goal, because it winds up being a beautiful goal that gets flushed down the toilet of history and becomes meaningless because we didn't turn it into anything. I also thought we showed a little naivete at the end, frankly, when we allowed ourselves to get into pushing and shoving and get caught up in Di Maria's histrionics as the last few seconds are winding down. But from a 30,000-foot view, from sort of a macro viewpoint, James, we've now lost or failed to win just about every game against a rival, for the past year that's possible. I mean, you go back, I guess the last win against a rival, meaningful win, would arguably be over Spurs. Maybe you could say Liverpool before that, but I think unfortunately what happens is when we look back at a season, we look at two things. What did we win? Did we win anything? And thankfully we did last season. But then the next thing you look at is, did you beat United? Did you beat City? Did you beat Chelsea? Did you beat Spurs? Did you beat Liverpool? At this point, do you think the season is salvageable at all? I mean, is there anything left for this season to be other than sort of an end game towards trying to stay in the top four? And how demoralizing do you think this winds up being for the players, for the fans, for the season, in terms of yet again in another big game again, and a team that is struggling, that was there for the taking, we failed to come through?
Well, it's hard but to see it as being anything other than a season that's going to be at least fairly demoralizing. But I'll try and put a slight positive spin on it. I think, if you want to look at it from a very macro point of view, is we've often, we've talked a lot about this being sort of the 2014 or 2015 era as being, the change of Arsenal Football Club, the sort of financial dynamic that has altered with the debt being sort of paid off, and that has been seen in the signing of Messi and the signing of this, and we all agree of this. I think most of them were fairly astute, and in the long term, at least I'd like to think, in the deficiencies that we do have, although we tend to seem to have at least one or two deficiencies each season, is that as much criticism as we'll levy towards Wenger, especially in the transfer market, is you'd like to think that whether it be January, whether it be this summer, when players are now being brought in, we're bringing a player of a certain caliber and a certain level of quality. And despite the performances, and we can maybe talk a little bit about, well, as we have mentioned, is sort of this undying faith and trust that Wenger puts into his players, certainly in sort of the Ramseys and the Wilsheres, and the kind of sort of tactical naivety that we've witnessed in this side. But it's hard not to look at that team and say, you have a potential world beater. I certainly think in an Alexis Sanchez, and you look at an Oxlade-Chamberlain, who I think is certainly one of the positive sparks and lights that we can draw from in these last few games, and you can look towards maybe a Jack and certainly an Aaron, given his form from last season, and you think to yourself that it doesn't really take much. It takes one of those players, not necessarily to sort of shoot off and become this world class, match winning performer, but if you get one of those three. And I know this is very hypothetical. I know we often like to talk, especially among sort of the British and the Arsenal players, of players that can sort of come to the forefront of the game. But it's not hard to imagine that one of Aaron, or one of those three, really does start to become a player that can put in a consistent shift. And at least if those types of players with the kind of squad that we have start bringing in the level of performance that we can at least reasonably expect from them, and then continue to build on that squad, aside from whether you're a Wenger out or you're a Wenger in, I still have a lot of faith in this squad, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily something that will be attributed to this season per se. But I do think if you look in the long run, whether you look to 15, 16 and past that, this is a very stable team. I mean, you've got a lot of youth. You've got a team that's now been together cohesively for a while. I think you can maybe draw to sort of the lack of cohesion we've suffered from the slight change of formation, whether it be the sort of 4-1-4-1 formation or the kind of 4-4-2 that we've now implemented with both Welbeck and Sanchez being new to the side. And injuries aside, that's always going to be a slight issue, although I think Ronald Koeman may argue otherwise. But yeah, I think you often talk about it on your Twitter handle quite regularly that and you've mentioned it just now, that aside from winning a trophy and aside from just, this sort of fourth place position and getting into the Champions League, one of the most important things is that feeling, that sensation, that emotion of coming out of a game and against a big rival and getting that important victory, especially at home. I haven't felt quite as despondent after a game for quite some time as today. And it does seem, especially given that, the facts we've mentioned regarding Wenger and his lack of sort of, meticulous tactical twinkering when playing different types of sides, that these top managers seem to quite consistently get the better of him. And I'm not sure if this is true, but I know on the way back on the tube, my friend was indicating that of the last 54 possible points against top four teams, we've only managed to gain 9 points, which, if it is true, and it certainly doesn't seem, and it certainly does seem feasible, is fairly shocking. It's quite depressing because, football is a very short. It's a game that's very short term. You get a lot of sort of quick joys from it, and it's the excitement of the game, and it's the now and then, and above everything, even when you're winning a league and when you're winning a trophy, it's about enjoying those individual moments. It's about enjoying that sort of Henry last minute winner. That was the sort of the one game I looked fondly at against United, sort of at the Emirates. And when you look at this team now, you go into these types of games sort of just hoping to not be embarrassed and sort of desperately praying that something will come of it, rather than this sort of previous, arrogance and swag that we used to have, and this knowledge that, like over a large sort of period of games, there was going to be at least a decent few that we could come away with, feeling fairly upbeat. And the kind of conversation we're having now, although this is a new podcast, it seems to be a fairly repetitive conversation, at least certainly for the last few months, if not the last couple of seasons. And that in itself is extremely frustrating. But
go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I mean, just sort of finishing off, as I did mention, there is that, I guess, that sort of hopefully undying optimist in me that does think that if you look at the squad on paper, if you look, you do look to sort of cover those cracks. That I think, although there is the argument that Wenger rarely does ever sort of replace every single deficiency in the side. If you do look to the kind of financial change that's taken place, if those issues are resolved, and hopefully, maybe you can suggest that there's just still a little bit of growing that this team needs. That I do think there's hope that this is a team that can still I think will still certainly finish in the top four, but can come into next season off the back of, towards the end of the season, having had a very strong run, and then, which is, I know, isn't all that promising in itself, but can look in towards the future season and think that this is actually a team that is in itself strong, because as of right now, for me, this season's already pretty much a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, and Paul, I'll turn it over to you in a second. I just want to answer that for 1 second, because I think there are two interesting things there. This is the problem. Even if every player in the squad performed at their best level, there would have been a ceiling on what we could achieve this season, because we failed to strengthen at defensive midfield and because we failed to add that extra center back that we needed. We left ourselves short, and even if every player performed at the level that we hoped they would, we were probably going to fall short because of those structural flaws in the squad. Then when players underperform expectations and you already have structural flaws in the side, that's how a season becomes a house of cards that falls apart. In order for us to have had a good season where we were challenging for the title this year, think of how well our attacking players and midfield players would have had to play to overcome the fact that a Nacho Monreal is being drafted in a center back and a Callum Chambers is starting every week at right back and Matthew Flamini is getting meaningful starts in defensive midfield. You have to be perfect everywhere else to overcome those things. And we're not perfect. And I think my problem with the optimism towards next season is, I think you're right, James. I think we could very well finish in the top four, although I don't think that's anymore a foregone conclusion. I think there's real doubts that this team will turn it around. But the problem is, if we come back and do finish in the top four, what evidence is there that we will suffer the same problems next season of being tactically naive, dropping points we shouldn't, failing to strengthen in areas of obvious weakness, having players that continue to get drafted into the side despite underperforming, because it's not 6 months of evidence of that or a year and a half of evidence of that. But with all due respect, it's 5 years, 8 years, 9 years of that. So, Paul, I guess the question is this season over? I mean, forget top four for a minute, because truthfully, if we're going to get 7 points in our Champions League group by beating Anderlecht once and Galatasaray once in a draw and then get blown out by Bayern Munich, I realize we need to be in the Champions League to attract and keep top players, but the experience of it from a fan standpoint certainly isn't delivering. I mean, is this season over, or can you paint a picture in your mind, not just fantastically and LSD inspired, but like based on actual reason and logic, where you can see this season turning around in a way where it would end feeling like it was some semblance of a success?
Yeah, I can, but it's the bigger stretch of the two. It's pretty easy to come up with reasons why it's a busted flush. But here's how I see feeling. If I feel good at the end of the season, it'll probably be because around the Christmas window, Ivan goes in and sits in front of Arsene and says, Arsene, we need to get a player, a good one. Here's the money. You know you have it. You got to do it. If not just for footballing reasons, to keep it sane around this club. So that's one piece of it. And I don't think that's necessary. Of course, we can see football reasons why that's needed. And I disagree a little bit with your point about us having needed to have been perfect coming into this season, and not having the people in place, because momentum is everything. And we saw that with Liverpool last year. They had a fatally flawed squad, but when things start rolling for you instead of against you, you can. Now, it would have been hard to overcome this much more robust Chelsea team this year, but I think we all would have taken a really good run at the title, missing by a couple of points but playing great football. And I think we could have done that this year had we got the momentum thing going in our favor instead of against our favor.
Yeah, but Paul, what I meant by perfect, I mean just like Ramsey would have had to have replicated his form from last season, and Welbeck and Sanchez would have had to hit the ground running, which, to be fair, they did, and we would have had to avoid injuries. And like because we left deficiencies in the squad in key areas, I just mean that we really couldn't afford to have anything else go against us because we had already stacked the deck kind of against ourselves, if that makes sense.
It does, but it's not a math formula, and we know that.
That's
and
true.
Momentum's momentum, and teams find a way of winning. So yeah, I hear where you're coming from. Back to the bigger
interestingly,
point.
not to get overwhelmingly stats oriented, but there's a statistic called expected goals.
Yep.
XG.
Michael Cayley.
Yeah,
Yep.
Michael Cayley, exactly. And he talks about it on Twitter. And if you don't follow him, I think he's MC of A, something along those lines, MC dash of A, or anyway. Interesting statistics, but our expected goals and the expected goals of our opposition, we are vastly underperforming our expected goals. And based on the stats, we project out to comfortably finish in the top four. But, the irony is, I think those stats can also be turned around the other way and say our players are showing a dramatic lack of quality when it's needed, or bottle or nerve or whatever you want to call it, because they're failing to score as many goals as their positions and opportunities would make it out to be. So I think you can look at both sides of that coin.
And conversely, conceding more than they should. I mean, it's back to the 80% thing. 80% of our performance, game by game, is league leading.
Yeah,
it's the finishing and the flubs on defense. The Boney climbing over the top of Monreal.
I believe that was
Gomes,
right? It was Gomes who climbed over Monreal.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Same difference.
Yeah, same difference. Those one or two moments in the game, but we're not allowing a lot of moments in the game. But the ones we are allowing, we're flubbing. And conversely, on the other end, we're unlike last year where we weren't creating a lot. We kind of overperformed last year. We got a lot of good finishing from a lot of low product. This year, there's plenty of product, and we're not allowing the opposition that much.
Yeah.
But it's that the last touch on each end that's killing us.
All right, so let's do
yeah.
this. Before we wrap up, I want to hit two more things that I think we should at least get to. First of all, let's talk what we've got on the immediate horizon, because we come off this game. We've had 2 weeks off to process some dreadful results. We get an even worse result, and now we've got to face Dortmund. Now, the Dortmund game is interesting to me because it is not really a meaningful game in theory. We probably will be going through the knockout round, even if we lose to Dortmund heavily. I don't think there's too many scenarios where I genuinely believe we will not get out of our group. And we have some very difficult games coming up domestically. Away to West Brom, home to Southampton, away to Stoke, home to Newcastle, away to Liverpool, home to Queen's Park Rangers, away to West Ham, and at Southampton. And that takes us through New Year's Day. It's not a particularly easy run. Not a lot of easy games. I mean, maybe Newcastle at home, but they've been in good form. I mean, Queen's Park Rangers at home, you'd hope would be a win. But so a couple of things. How important is the Dortmund game now in the context of what's happened in terms of the possibility that it could stop the rot and just lift people? Should the manager heavily rotate and be prioritizing the league now, given that the Dortmund game is not important in terms of the result? James, if you're manager for a day, do you use the Dortmund game as a chance to rotate and refresh and really focus on the league, or do you now see it as almost a must-win to try to get the fans and the players and the club, moving back in the right direction?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, I think we've talked, or certainly Paul has touched on the importance of momentum in this game, and in this business. And I think, really it's the way up of do you think that resting players and giving them some time off before sort of going into a Premier League fixture is the ideal sort of preparation for getting them to sort of perform to their best abilities, or do you want to take a game like Dortmund where we are at home and we're playing a side that although they've been extremely strong in the Champions League, have certainly struggled in the Bundesliga, and given the prestige and sort of the the management of Klopp, etc., it's a game that I'll say it's a game that we could potentially sort of really build off. But I think we've looked at the sort of international break prior to this one, where we said, well, if we get a good run of results against Sunderland, Burnley, Hull, very winnable fixtures, and start to build momentum, well, maybe that can kickstart our season. And now we're saying, well, maybe the home fixture against United and the home fixture against Dortmund can kickstart our season. So it's we seem to sort of be playing a slightly broken record, but yes, in theory, if especially against a team like Dortmund at home, I personally, I think, especially given that one of the major issues we've had as a side is this, given in my opinion, certainly the quality of players that we do have at our disposal is sort of the lack of, I guess, chemistry or a lack of ability to sort of gel as a team thus far, given the slight changes that have taken place. And I think perhaps that still takes more time. I don't think it should have taken anywhere near as much time as it has. But given where we are, I think the first 11 has to continue to play, and I think we have to, because hopefully, there will come a moment this season, I think, where it does begin to click and we do begin to develop that sort of spontaneity and that momentum. And I can but hope that it will be against Dortmund.
Do you think we can beat Dortmund?
Yeah, I think do I think we will?
No, do you think we can? Is there any universe where you can
yes, absolutely.
Dortmund?
Yeah, we can beat Dortmund, certainly.
See, I will tell you, I don't think there's one chance in 100 we can beat Dortmund.
I think we can.
I would not approach that game with anything resembling any intent to win it. I would rotate everybody out. And I'll tell you why just quickly.
How about this just quickly?
Mm-hmm.
When we went to Bayern Munich away a season and a half ago or so, and we won 2-0 with sort of Jenkins at a right back. Now, needless of the fact that he was an insurmountable sort of having already
it was a dead rubber, but yeah, okay.
It was a slight dead rubber, but still it was Munich at the Allianz Arena,
right?
Whatever I can't remember the stats, but they hadn't lost for X amount of games at the time,
and it built the bridge that took us to top 4 that season,
and it built quite the bridge, on that fact, and it also was a game that I think there wasn't exactly particularly much optimism going into. In fact, I think I'd be surprised if you'd said anything much different as you would say going into a game like Dortmund. And I think aside
But can I
from
tell you why I have so much pessimism about the Dortmund game, just really quickly?
you're more than welcome to, yeah,
Just
sure.
a couple of sentences. Because I think the blueprint that works for beating us is something Dortmund does as well as any team in the world. And that is press in midfield, counterattack at pace. They're excellent at pressing on the ball, and they're excellent at counterattacking at pace. And they're not a team that needs possession to win. They prefer to not have possession to win. I think unfortunately the things that they do well are the things that we tend to get beaten by. And I admittedly I'm being a little over the top with the pessimism here. I mean, obviously there is a scenario where we could beat them, but I think when they won't have Marco Reus because unfortunately he suffered that horrible injury day. All right, well, how about this? Paul, settle the argument. Can we beat Dortmund? Should we approach that game as an important game to win, or should it be all hands to the pump for the Premier League? I mean, play heavily rotate and prioritize domestic.
Okay, we can beat them. Will we beat them? I don't know. I like your pessimism because if we get a result there, it will seem to have some meaning. It's kind of a bit of a dead rubber in some ways for both teams. So that makes it a tricky sort of a game. I think it's a very dangerous game. There's a lot of downside to us losing or not performing, and not that much upside because people will dismiss it and because there's a lack of belief generally, and people will say, well, what's the real thing? Our Dortmund performance or our performance against the previous teams? And they'll lean that way. So there's not a lot of upside here, but winning always beats losing. So in terms of putting a run together, it's important we start to put together a solid performance more than a brilliant performance against Dortmund.
Well, would you rotate at all? A little bit? Not at all? I mean, what's your?
I would rotate a little bit, but not because of the lack of importance of the team. I think there's,
surely you have to give someone like Sanchez a day off finally, right?
Yeah, and he certainly might be due a rest. But those are decisions you can only make if you're the manager on the training pitches of Colney, working with your data guys and your fitness guys. But,
sure,
from a very long distance away, you got to say Sanchez is due a rest at this stage.
And this is what frustrates me.
Must be in the squad for a reason.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, here's my frustration. Let's say he did rotate a few players in, and the players he rotates in excel in a win over Dortmund. I don't necessarily believe that would earn them a place in the squad in the next game at West Brom. It reminds me a little like Brendan Rodgers, who rotated heavily away to Real Madrid, and then praised the performance of the players he brought in and then dropped them all for the next game against Chelsea. I think part of the point of rotation is so that players believe they have so some players get a chance to rest, but so that other players believe they have a fighting chance for a place in the side. One of the best examples, I think, of what rotation can do for the form of a player is when he benched Szczesny a couple seasons ago for Fabianski, and then Fabianski got injured. Or was it Minone? It was Fabianski, right?
Yeah, it was Fabianski.
And then Szczesny got his job back, came in and performed brilliantly through the season. I think, when you feel there's genuine competition for your place, it's very different from illusory competition for your place. But all right, so let's move on. One other thing that I just wanted to touch on, just really quickly, I think we can sort of wrap up here. There's a tough run of games coming up. It's not impossible to see us losing again, especially in light of the fact that we've only won 4 times this season. We have Southampton home and away between now and New Year's. We have West Brom away, which isn't particularly easy. We have Liverpool away. Is there any scenario, James, where you can see the manager's position becoming untenable during the season? I mean, if we were to go to West Brom and lose, and then lose to Southampton, and then lose at Stoke, is there any scenario where it becomes untenable, or where Arsene himself would say, you know what, I need to step aside? Is there any scenario where that would happen in season? Is there any scenario where we could even see that happening at the end of the season? Or do you believe this is our manager till the end of this next contract, come hell or high water, and whatever the results are?
I'm inclined to believe that come what may, to a certain degree, Wenger will be here for the next year and a half. I think we've often talked about, I think Wenger has said in himself that the club showed a lot of faith in him, and I think during this sort of barren period, the club will testify that Wenger has shown a lot of faith in the club. I think, he's had plenty of opportunities, whether it be to go to Bayern Munich or Madrid or PSG, etc. And I'm sure a particularly lucrative wage structure. But I think part of my answer is based on the fact that I struggle to see us actually encountering the worst case scenario where we're actually faced with the fact that Wenger may very well be on the cusp of being booted out. I mean, if we were to go on a run of losing sort of the next 10 games in a row, having no hope of being in the top four, I think you'd start to notice an extremely sour sort of atmosphere at the Emirates and amongst the fan base. If we were to get knocked out of the FA Cup fairly early on, we're probably going to be knocked out of the last 16 of the Champions League. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Then, sure, I mean, in that scenario, I think it's a situation we've never faced with Wenger. I mean, I think one of the sort of faults we've talked about with regards to us, and one of the aspects of his managerial career with us has been the pure consistency in which he has at least provided the sort of top four spot. And I guess when you look at sort of the wages the players are paid, etc., he's always sort of achieved kind of the bare minimum with the squad that's at his disposal. And I still struggle to see that not being the case with the team this year. Speaking in hypotheticals, yes, it's possible. I think there is a scenario where the board has to seriously consider Wenger's position, but I think that has to be extremely severe. Especially, I think all the voices from the club seem to suggest that there's a significant sort of affection and love for the manager, and there seems to be a very sort of common bond amongst the two as to where they see this club going.
Yeah, and by the way, I just want to be clear, even though I've been very critical of the manager, I'm not sure I see any benefit to changing the manager in the middle of the campaign. I still have faith in, at a minimum, his ability to potentially steer us back to top four finish again. And while I don't think we will ever win the title again under Arsene, and not just because of circumstances, but because I think Arsene Wenger is a once great manager who has now been passed by his peers and is in the autumn of his career. I still think certainly he can get us to the minimum result, which seems to be sort of his standard, sort of his standard requirement now. What about you, Paul?
Just very quickly, Elliot. Very quickly on that.
Yeah.
And I will sort of mitigate this by saying I've always been a very sort of strong lover of Arsene at the club. I'm still a little. It still sort of baffles me that a sort of a name as rare as Arsene managed to sort of actually manage a team with the name of Arsenal. But aside from that aside, we've talked a lot about this 14-15 season as being the season. I talked about it briefly earlier, but there's still a little gap in this squad. There's still more room for change, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily just down to this complete this naivety that we've seen in Wenger over the past seasons. I think there is a little bit of Wenger now only really but again, this is me sort of looking on the positive side of him, really sort of waiting for that sort of that top, as he refers to it, top quality being available. I personally would like to see him have, when a lot of people talked about this sort of FA Cup win being, maybe the best time for him to leave, and I talked about wanting to see him actually have the ability to use this cash. I've quite adamantly amongst my friends said, well, I'm actually excited to see maybe give him that one season in 15-16 where there's no excuses really to not have a fully established squad as a whole, and see if maybe that's when we see that sort of that change in the team, rather than this team that's always sort of tripping over hurdles throughout the season and kind of just about making it over the finish line for the fourth position. But again, that might just me being the sort of the the Wenger aficionado and the sort of
No,
optimist that I
I
am.
think you can make an argument for it. I think there are also people, without wanting to get into it too much further, that would say this was supposed to be that season, and still more people would say last season was supposed to be that season. That if he had pushed the boat out a little further for a striker last season, he would have won the title last season. I think the risk you run is Chelsea are getting further away, not closer. This season, if nothing else, we should have built on last season. We should be, from a points standpoint, this is a weak Premier League. And if we're not as good as Chelsea, at the very least, we should be battling for second and looking on course for the same points or more points than last season. And quite clearly, that's not what's happening. So, I think it's pretty disappointing. But I see your point, and it's not that I'm not open to it. I just don't particularly see it that way. I mean, Paul, if you're making the decision, is there any scenario where you would relieve the manager of his duties during the season or at the end of the season, or are you 100% committed to the idea that he should be the manager till the end of this contract?
Or option 4,
Yeah,
I'm going with, certainly it would be just horrible at this club if we forced the manager out during the season.
I agree with that.
Just appalling. I'd like to think that won't happen and would never happen with this manager, or with really any manager we had who was trying to do the right things and who hadn't taken a bung. So I don't see that scenario. I don't see the board won't act against him, nor should they. The scenario in which Arsene leaves before the end of his contract is the one in which he says to himself, I'm not the person to take it up that next step. He's still a very proud man in the best way, not, all this stuff about him being stubborn. Yes, he is stubborn, but so is anybody with a vision. Now, so it can go either way. The question is he good stubborn or is he bad stubborn? He's obviously, if you ever listen to him, he's got all his marbles. He's as smart as he ever was. Does his philosophy work going forward? I think he's as well positioned to work out if he's played all his cards, if he has another joker, if he has another ace, as anybody. And if that's a little bit of a cop-out, I think he's owed that. I don't think he's going to want to do this job if he doesn't have answers, if he doesn't have a way of rejigging things. There's a very strong squad where 80 to 90% of it, no matter how bad things are going at the moment, people actually like this team and those players. It's not like 2 or 3 years ago where you could have come up with, it was all the dead wood and, what's this guy doing in the squad? And there's almost none of those players. There's almost nobody that people are saying, what the hell is he doing in our squad? They might be wondering why he's being played there or why there isn't another player to supplement it. This is Wenger's squad, Wenger's team. He's still as sharp as a razor. Yes, he's stubborn and proud, but I think in the best way. And, I could see him saying he's not the right person to take us forward, but I can also see him saying and knowing that there's another roll of the dice here. And if we end strong this year and we start getting our shit together and we start learning how to play the way we ought to be playing, we can end on a high. We can go into the summer, fill the gaps. I know we've been here a couple of years before, but if it's not Wenger retooling, it'll be somebody else retooling, and that'll set us back too. So, I got my fingers crossed that Arsene's as smart as I think he is.
You know what I would say, Paul? I think Arsene is as smart as he always was, and his ideas are as good as they always were. I would say the problem is the ideas haven't necessarily evolved, and that there are methods and styles and approaches and ideas now that have evolved, that are changing, and I just don't know if he's changed with them.
And while I agree with that, I also think he's still really, really smart, and he'll be the first canary in the coal mine. the day he looks at football and says, the Klopp, Simeones, etc., this is where the game's going, and I don't have an answer for that, I think he'll put his hand up and say, I've had my fun. I think he's that smart.
You know what? The only thing that nags at me that disagrees, and I don't want to go too much further with this, and I'm not this guy. I'm not a guy who makes this argument a lot, but I think it's naive not to at least raise it. You can't allow yourself to forget just how much money this man makes managing Arsenal. I know some people in my life, not myself, unfortunately, but people that make that kind of money, and you'd be amazed at how nervous they are that they won't continue to make that amount of money.
I think we'd be amazed how many other opportunities he will have to make money.
That's fair. You know what? Fair point. All right. Well, let's leave it
there.
Probably
even more money on that.
Yeah.
Than that. But I just very quickly,
he's not friends with the Saudis over at PSG and all these different places.
For nothing.
There's loads of money out there.
No, that's a fair point.
But just very quickly.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, we could talk about this until the cows come home. But I mean, just a quick question that I'll pose to the both of you is: do you think, given that he's our manager, given that it's part of the team that we follow and we live and breathe, that it's easier for us to sort of pick upon his flaws and the issues that we face with him being the manager of our club, especially when you see we often talk about Klopp being sort of an ideal replacement for Wenger, and you look towards like a Roberto Martinez that hasn't exactly, I don't think personally, has set sort of the world delight at Everton or even a Van Gaal at United this season, and you see that there's a wide array of issues that many of these top managers face, even in the now and then, that we're a little less sort of keen to kind of touch upon. Whereas this idea of change and this idea of bringing in someone new is kind of the panacea to all of our issues.
I don't think it's a panacea. I think quite the opposite. I think it could mean it goes worse at first. I think the point is, if the current solution isn't going to get us to where our goals should be, then another solution should be sought out. Now, that doesn't mean the next solution will be the right one or even a better one, but the potential that the next solution could be worse is not a reason not to seek it out. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if you hate your job, you should take another one. Now, you may wind up hating the next job, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't quit the one you're at. I just think that there's another point just really, really quickly, which is just that sometimes it's not that the person isn't as good as they used to be. It's just that the person and the job have outgrown each other. I mean, it's hard for people to do something for 15, 20, 30 years at the same place and be as good at it at that place for that period of time. I mean, Klopp, I think, is an excellent manager. Maybe Klopp needs a new challenge. Maybe knowing he can never win the Bundesliga because of Bayern has burned him out there. And maybe Arsene has the same thing, just position fatigue. But, ultimately, I think we're going to find out over the next couple of weeks, whether there's real progress ahead. And obviously, when we buy 4 or 5 or 6 players on January 2nd, it'll be a whole new season. So that'll be worth looking forward to. Let's go ahead and leave it there since the cows literally just walked into my house. So I think we've reached our point. Hey, once again, for these 2 insightful individuals who you're going to want to follow on Twitter, you can find James at Gooner Fanatic 49 and Paul at Poznan in my pants. Not in my pants, in his pants, but it's Poznan in my pants.
It was just the one time, Elliot.
Well, you know what? One time is better than no times. Like the one time in 15 we've beaten United. Hey, James, Paul, thanks so much. Great talking to you, James.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Paul,